NewYorkBIO hosted our first ever Patient Engagement Summit in April 2021, bringing together leaders from industry, advocacy organizations, and patients and caregivers for an event centered on the role and voice of the patient in biotech innovation. We'd like to thank our sponsors, including our presenting sponsor, Pfizer, our panel sponsors, Semaphore, Circuit Clinical, Ovid Therapeutics, and Bristol Myers Squibb, as well as Alexion, Horizon, Lexeo Therapeutics, and UCB. We're also fortunate to have several patient organization partners, including the American Cancer Society's Cancer Action Network, the AMED Alliance, the Allergy and Asthma Network, the Arthritis Foundation, the Association of Oncology Social Work, the Autoimmune Registry, the Children's Tumor Foundation, the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, the International Pain Foundation, the Lupus and Allied Diseases Association, the National Eczema Association, New York Oncology and Hematology, Patients Rising, Sickle Cell Thalassemia Patients Network, and Stronger Than Sarcoidosis. This panel discusses the role of small biotechs in innovation, sponsored by Ovid Therapeutics, featuring Imran Babar from Sidan and Tiborio Therapeutics, Norma Noah from the University of Buffalo, Stormy Chamberlain from the University of Connecticut. It's moderated by Luke Rosen of Ovid Therapeutics.
Hi there, everybody. I just want to make sure I'm on. Thanks so much for having us, and it's a real pleasure for me to be moderating this wonderful panel discussion. And it's thanks to NewYorkBIO and to the team for having us here. I don't want to take too much time. I'm Luke Rosen. I'm the Vice President of Accelerated Development and Community Engagement at Ovid Therapeutics. And Ovid is a small biotech located in New York who we work on developing therapeutics for rare neurological conditions. I'm also the founder of KIF1A.org, which is an organization we started shortly after my daughter was diagnosed with KIF1A associated neurological disorder, which comes from a mutation in the KIF1A gene. And so I really, if you had asked me what biotech was 5 years ago, I would have said something about a robot and science. I really had no experience in biotech other than just being very interested in the science. But after Susanna was diagnosed, we started the foundation, and then I went back to school. I have a master's in bioethics, and started working at Ovid in 2017, or the end of 2017 and 18. And this topic is such an important one to me. I think that my only real frame of reference is small biotech when we talk about industry and biotech. I think too often we hear people talk about the community and what that means, and I think often it's more isolated than it really is or really should be. I think when we talk about and I'll be specific to rare diseases, and I know where when we talk about the community, the industry and biotech is very much part of that community. So when I say the rare disease community, I think of so many different stakeholders. And I think that when I think of why small biotech is important in the R&D process and specifically in innovation is I think that, and I was talking to Stormy about this just before we went on here, and it's that as part of that community, biotech and the folks who are innovating to develop potential treatments for conditions really need to be able to work at the pace that the researchers, clinicians, and the patient organizations and caregivers are working at, because there's this inherent sense of urgency that's teeming throughout the entire journey and process for patients and families and caregivers, at least in my experience, in that of our organization, our caregiver organization. And that really needs to be mirrored in the folks who are working to innovate and to bring those potential therapeutics. And I think it just doesn't work unless every member of that community is a driving force and a vital part of that process. So I think just in my experience and in looking at biotech and R&D from the point of view as a caregiver, somebody who helped start an organization, and now somebody who works in biotech, I think the only way to do it is to really integrate the patient and caregiver experience into every element of process. And I know that I'm just so lucky to be joined by my good friend Stormy Chamberlain, who is a researcher and a scientist who's just incredibly committed, and folks like Imran and Norma. So it's a real pleasure to be here. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to each of my colleagues and friends here to say a little bit about themselves. Maybe Stormy, would you like to?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I'm Stormy Chamberlain. I'm the John and Donna Kranicki Professor of Genomics and Personalized Healthcare and an Associate Professor of Genetics and Genome Sciences at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine. My lab uses induced pluripotent stem cells. These are where we take, the patient samples and convert them into stem cells. We use those to study 3 disorders that relate to the same genetic region on chromosome 15. We try to study gene regulation with the idea that if we can manipulate gene regulation, that those are good therapeutic approaches. We want to design these targeted genetic therapeutics for these 3 disorders.
Thanks, Stormy. I know I'm sorry, turning on mute here. Thanks for that, Stormy. And Imran, maybe I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Hi, thank you, Luke. It's a pleasure to be here as well. My name is Imran Baber, and I am the Chief Business Officer at Cyden. I'll say a bit more about Cyden in a minute, but my background is actually in healthcare finance, and my most recent role was at OrbiMed Advisors on the venture capital team. Prior to joining the venture capital team at OrbiMed, I actually co-founded a nonprofit called Rare Genomics Institute that's really focused on helping patients with rare diseases. And I'm still actively involved with the nonprofit as a volunteer and as the chief scientific officer. What Rare Genomics focuses on is really initially focused on helping patients get a diagnosis for their condition. And since getting established, we've actually expanded to a number of other initiatives, including patient advocacy, educating patients, as well as promoting research for rare diseases. So Cyden is actually, I'd say, almost the definition of a small biotech in that we are actually in the company creation business. And so one way to think of Cyden is that we're a bit of a hybrid between a biotech company and a venture fund. So like a venture fund in that we have a pool of capital from a set of investors. We have 5 investors. And we are able to evaluate assets specifically in the rare disease space and then allocate resources to specific projects that meet predefined criteria. We're like a biotech in the sense that we actually are operators. So everyone on the team is a drug developer, and we actually develop the drugs ourselves using an outsourced model. We are specifically focused on rare diseases. And I'd say one of the foundational pieces of Cyden is that we're very intentional about understanding the patient perspective. So we have a number of collaborations with nonprofit organizations, and specifically for projects that we're working on, we look to understand the patient perspective.
Thanks, Imran. That's great. And Norma, maybe just a quick couple of.
Sure.
What you do.
Hi, so Norma Noah. By training, I'm a human geneticist and genomicist, and I was part of the Human Genome Project. During that time, I was fortunate to be working in one of the labs at the Roswell Park Cancer Institute. I then left and went to the University of Buffalo. But during the 90s, my husband was diagnosed with a type of cancer, Hodgkin's lymphoma. And at the time, we were told that he was one of the lucky ones, because if you're going to get cancer, this is the one to get. Very early stage disease, and yet he succumbed to the lymphoma within 2 years. So it left me, a very 38-year-old with 2 little toddlers, sitting there thinking, this is what I do for a living, and I couldn't help the one person that really mattered to me. So through the work at the University of Buffalo, we drove to create the New York State Center of Excellence in Bioinformatics and Life Sciences back in 2001. And in part, that center was established to really serve as a bridge between the university and life science companies. At slightly further down the line, I founded a company a molecular diagnostics company, so that we could really better stratify patients and understand what differentiated them across a disease entity like Hodgkin's disease. So our Center of Excellence really brought a designation to Buffalo, which not only put a building up and the infrastructure within the building, but helped create a very rich ecosystem for small biotech companies. So in the heart of Buffalo, if you would have been here 20 years ago, the medical school was out on, way out on Main Street. It's now in the heart of downtown Buffalo. There's a clinical and translational research center. There's a freestanding children's hospital, the John R. Oshai Children's Hospital. The Kaleida Health System is located, again, in the heart of the city. So what we really have are all of these institutions and healthcare facilities in a fairly defined area. And the programs that we run through the Center of Excellence not only provide the infrastructure and facilities such as a genomic sequencing and bioinformatics core, a biorepository for patient cohorts, our Center for Computational Research, but we also provide academic and business development experts to enable the small biotech companies. We provide funding for capital equipment and project-based funding for the companies to collaborate with the university, again, saving them funding on that side. And we, give them access to shared equipment and facilities so they don't have to invest in those themselves at the very early stages of their business. So really, I think, I come at this from a little bit different angle. I'm kind of a hybrid between all of you, where I span that ground between academia and, the company setting, but driven really by a passion for the experience that my family had and really wanting to change the lives of other patients and their families. And that's really, I think, where we're all centered at, that patients really at the heart of everything we do, whether it be in research or in the companies. And without, that passion for their experience and making their lives better, we're not in this really, I'm not in this for the money. I'm in this because I really deeply care about other families like mine, as well as when I look at rare disorders and I think about the luck that I had to have two healthy children. So that's my background, and I'm happy to continue on.
Thanks, Norma. That's really great. I think it's a great segue into the conversation where it should go. I love the idea of describing it as a hybrid, right? And I think that's really important. And how one goes, I realized early that in order to kind of knock down those walls and to make the entire community really focused on what matters most, like you just said, is that you do also have to have that mentality of, especially, and Imran, you might know this as a small biotech, or even folks who are in the startup phase, is no company, no treatment, right? Because if there's that moment, and Stormy, maybe you could speak to this, about when we move from discovery to development, right? So you need that development part to kind of be the downstream baton that takes the work that is happening before. And so I think that that moment between discovery and development really is translation, right? That's the translation part. And so Stormy, I wonder if you might speak to two things. One is one thing that you mentioned was that your lab works on diseases, right? And so I'm wondering if you might speak a little bit about how working on one condition or one disease might inform that of other diseases that might be in a pipeline or in a research interest. So maybe you could speak to that.
No, it's a great question. So it's been my experience that, so I work in Angelman syndrome, which is a single gene disorder. And I can distinctly remember when the first evidence that you could activate. So Angelman syndrome is a disorder where one gene is mutated, but you can turn on the other copy of the gene. And that's, of course, a really cool therapeutic handle, if you will. And I remember when this first was demonstrated that you could turn on this other copy of the gene, because what happened is that after that, one company became interested in the disorder. And then soon there were many companies. And I also chair the scientific advisory committee for the Angelman Syndrome Foundation. I honestly can't tell you how many companies are interested in Angelman syndrome as a disorder now, based on one company jumping in the pool. So in thinking about that, I study two other disorders, and it makes me excited as a researcher because I can see that going forward, and I want to give those disorders that opportunity as well. And I can see that the patient advocacy groups get excited about it. The companies are very excited about it. And so it just brings this enthusiasm once one gets there. And so I think that that's a model that I use sports analogies a lot. Build it and they will come, right? And I think, if you can show and demonstrate a proof of principle for one disorder, everybody jumps on, and that's going to follow for other disorders as well.
Right. What a great answer. I think that's so true. And I think one thing, there's one element, I see a question came up here, that how can researchers and companies really listen to patients, and how do they find the right people in the science? And I think a lot of that comes from there's a dialogue that happens within the patient community, and as all of you guys know, in the caregiver community. And it's not within just one community. It spans across several communities that have similar challenges, right? And so by identifying those similar challenges, we might be able to, on the discovery end, really, and the development end, really be able to say, okay, well, these similar challenges are something we might be able to address, which could be kind of a shotgun approach, right? So I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle. And Imran, I'm wondering if you might be able to speak a little bit about how starting in the very early stages of a company and moving from, maybe not moving from, but incorporating that skill set you have of starting a nonprofit, and the business model that is so similar to how patient organizations start, sort of galvanizing as a community and forming a nonprofit themselves, and how you can take that skill set and actually apply it to developing potential therapeutics to help people.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we do try to do early on, and this is, I'd say, in the evaluation phase, as we're even determining whether to take on a project, is to really understand the patient perspective. And I think, again, this is something that I think you do hear a lot about. But I think some of the specific things that we look at that can actually be very helpful in the process is really understanding what matters to the patients, and understanding, sort of their quality of life considerations that sometimes you won't even get from the physician community. And there's specifically a project actually that we're working on right now where you talk to the key opinion leaders and the physicians, and they will, I think, in many ways kind of downplay, and it's not anything against them, but they'll sort of downplay. They're not fully aware of the patient experience. But when we engage the patient community on sort of what is their quality of life, we just became more aware of some of the considerations that were not as emphasized in some of our other discussions, and even what we read about in the literature. So I think that for us was really critical. I think also just in terms of understanding, I think, patients have been incredibly helpful. I think especially in the earlier stages of a project, bringing awareness to an indication, to a disease area, I think has been absolutely crucial. And there are examples where patient organizations have actually built, established the foundation that can actually help researchers in terms of developing animal models and getting resources to really establish the foundation for scientific research in a particular disease area, which I think helps lower the bar for a company to take on a project. So I think that's another point that is really critical. I think also just in terms of as you're moving a drug forward, I think that engaging the patient community can be helpful for the company from the standpoint of clinical trial enrollment, and really just helping the patient community understand what is it that you're actually trying to do. So you're not sort of this mystery company coming out of nowhere where you're trying to enroll patients, but being able to garner that support, making them aware of what you're actually doing, I think can be very helpful. And then obviously when you're launching a drug, in terms of having the trust of the community is absolutely critical. So I think that from my perspective, I'd say from the nonprofit is really being able to engage with and empower the patient community as they're seeking out a treatment for their condition, or they're seeking out answers for their condition. And that's one of the things at Regenomics we really try to do. We really try to move, partner alongside of patients, and number one, help to educate them to the degree that we can, get ourselves educated about the disease, and then really provide a platform for them to be able to expand research on their disease. And then from the company side, I think, as I said earlier, just being able to engage them early on, understand, what is their perspective, what are the things that they actually want to have treated. So those are just some, I guess, initial thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, those are great thoughts. And I think what you're getting at really is, and I think this is incredibly important, is for, there's a responsibility that the patients and families have. And then a lot of times we rightfully so talk about how, we as industry can work to include and integrate that into our process. However, I think that there are these wonderful family organizations that think of it when you think about how do we de-risk the process for the biotech. And I think that families and organizations can't know how to de-risk it unless members of the scientific community are willing to teach and to tell the families, hey, look, in 2 months, we're going to have to do toxicology studies with animal models. Here's what you can do to help us make those animal models available to our early discovery teams. And here's what it takes to galvanize the community to enroll a clinical trial. And here's how you participate in clinical research. I think that one of the things that we could be doing better as a collective industry is making that process a little bit more clear to patients, families, and organizations about what they can do to eliminate the gaps in the process and make everything happen faster. I wonder, Norma, do you have any kind of insight about what, for those patient organizations and those caregivers that might be tuning in, what are a few things that they can focus on that would de-risk the development process and make things happen a little bit faster?
Well, I think one of the most critical pieces, whether you're a diagnostics firm or a therapeutics firm, is having access to patient samples. So we look at, the biorepositories that have existed, through the NIH. We have the All of Us program. I think a lot of the issues we've had in clinical trials and drug development before are, again, a lack of minority representation in our patient, in the patients, in the
Sure.
databases, as well as in the biorepositories, which is why we established a biorepository at the University of Buffalo. From my company's perspective, I know that in developing better diagnostic tools, we struggled to, again, find folks who are willing to share those patient, materials with us. We were looking for specific, patients who were diagnosed, had a specific gene marker that we could then, create a test with. And I think no matter, whether you are a drug development company or is it a diagnostics company, making families understand. So when you, walk into a research center or a community hospital, or, I've got a colleague who actually spoke in the earlier panel, Irfan Khan, we've talked about just how valuable creating we call them bio libraries are, such that patient resources are sometimes scarce. But if you have a rare disorder and one, academic health center has 10 patients, being able to collaborate with those patient resources, it's a quicker path to, again, figuring out, what is the gene and how can we, target that gene for a therapeutic. And without those patient resources, we get nowhere. So it's the patients and their families who really drive everything that we do. And, I'm sure that, I often look at like the Spinraza story and all of the things that, we discovered all of these genes that were responsible for genetic disorders during the Human Genome Project, and yet we still have such a long way to go on finding cures. I mean, I was very disappointed by the Huntington's trials being halted. I mean, it's just, this is what we do. We know what's wrong, but without having, again, the tools in place and the patients and their families to really, be our access points, better understanding what the, molecular issue is, and then how can we target that issue to, again, make their lives better and find cures for them.
Yeah, and that speaks to appropriate endpoints and outcome measures too, right? Is how are we to actually design trials and how are we to know what is actually meaningful? And Imran, to what you said, what matters most, right? And how can we integrate that what matters most into the R&D process
Sorry.
Please.
I was going to say, I think one really interesting example, and actually I think that Dr. Chamberlain would really know this probably better than anyone, is GeneTX and Ultragenyx. And so GeneTX, they're focusing on an ASO for Angelman. And I think they did a lot to be able to lower the bar to be able to partner with another larger company. I'm not sure, Stormy, I assume you know that story well, and if there's anything to comment on there, but I think that's a really good example of what we were just talking about.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess there's also a behind the scenes though as well. GeneTX is one of 3 companies that have similar ASO approaches. And it was important, of course, to access patient samples in those cases. And actually, some of those were brokered through an academic lab, through my academic lab, actually. And it's access to the patients. And I have to say that the way we were able to get access to those patients ended up being patient advocacy groups. The Angelman Syndrome Foundation connected us to the patients that eventually became the samples necessary to develop those therapeutics.
Yeah, it's a remarkable example. You're right, Imran, and the picture of how again, I use the word galvanize, how a community who galvanizes in the right direction, and that direction is the important part, right? Is keeping your eye on the ball and what direction you're going in. So I thanks for bringing that up, and Stormy, more on that. I wonder if you might be able to talk, and Ovid, at Ovid Therapeutics, we have a great collaboration with UConn and Stormy's lab, and we're so fortunate to be able to collaborate with Stormy. And one of the things that makes that collaboration so rich is Stormy's just deep commitment to the patient and caregiver community. And so I think it's one of those examples about how you tear down a barrier and make sure that you're not just working with one entity of this process, but really everybody. I wonder, Stormy, if you might be able to talk a little bit about what your lab collaborating with industry means, and what we can be doing better, and how to sort of forge those relationships, because I think there maybe aren't enough of them happening.
No, I mean, my lab collaborating with industry, believe me, it's a two-way street, right? So I get so much out of interacting with the patient advocacy groups, because it allows my students and the people doing the work to be motivated for the right reasons. I never have a problem with a student telling me they need another publication. They usually are excited about results or disappointed that the results don't move us as fast as we could be going, right? And so that's something we get out of it. But I guess what we give back is we go deep into the disorders, and we go deep into understanding. And so I'd like to share that understanding with anybody who can move therapeutics for the disorders forward, right? And so whether I've worked with this company or that company, I think from an academic perspective, it allows me to say, I'm going to do whatever's the best for the patient. I'm going to make these samples publicly available to as many people as possible, share as widely as possible to move the therapeutics forward. And I think we owe that to the patients. If they're donating the samples, if they're helping us, we owe it to them to make those go as far as possible and not try to stand in the way. I would argue what can be done more. I mean, I think companies need to look to who the experts are, right? Find these people who've gone deeply into a disorder and onboard them, because they have information that's going to take years for a company to onboard. And that's whether you're a large pharma or a small biotech. I think finding the experts is key.
Yeah, what a great answer. I think about and I'm sure I'll paraphrase what PJ Brooks from NIH said that was so impactful is when he said it's right now it's less about the science and more about the operations of things, and how we can really find the experts and actually operationalize them. I think we've learned a lot about that in the last few months. Certainly, there's a great question that just came in, and I want to make sure we get to this one. It's, how do small companies communicate when therapies fail? And how do they help maintain hope in scientific discovery if what they're working on doesn't work the way they had hoped? To me, this is a paradigm shift that needs to happen about communicating failures, right? And I think that understanding that, at least in the rare disease world, we have to fail. Nothing is going to happen if we're not risking failing and then risking again. The question is, can we do that rapidly? So when we fail, can we risk again rapidly? And can we be having multiple shots on goal at the same time? And as one of my colleagues and dear friends, Hans Kirsinger, says, is how can we be working non-sequentially? And I think that that's so important. And so I wonder if, I can just speak for me is just with complete transparency talking about failure and why it failed, what we're learning from the failures and what we're taking from those learnings and how we're going to make those learnings accelerate us even faster. Norma, how do you approach looking at what are failures and communicating those to multiple stakeholders and families and caregivers?
Well, I think no matter, whether you're in academia or in a private company, we all do research and we learn more from those failures than we do from our successes, right? And in a company setting, there's a company that, we work with in Buffalo, and they basically started back in like 2003, and they've just plugged away. They've raised lots of money. They're an oncology focused group. And recently, they received some bad news from the FDA, not killer news, but and there were folks around me who were like, oh God, we can't talk about them anymore. And I'm like, no, this is part of what happens in a company's lifespan. They will pick themselves up, and they will figure out what the problem is. And what I think, especially small biotech, worries about is then what happens to our funding, right? Are people going to pull out? So I think it's really being able to understand that, number one, small biotech has the advantage of being nimble. We can pivot. So if something doesn't work, okay, let's solve the problem. Let's figure out, what direction we're going to go in. And then have people who back us, the boards, the CEOs, who can then also continue to raise money based on the mission of the company. And I think communication, you tell the truth. This is what happened, and this is how we're going to solve it. And you keep the lines of communication open. And I think probably one of the best groups to be advocating for all of, for companies really are the patients and their families themselves. Be, deeply partnered with them, make them understand what's going on, why you're doing what you're doing, and get them to be the advocates and your spokespeople out there in the community.
That's such a great point. And with that comes the sort of the pact that company has to have with the communities that we're not going anywhere, right? So if we have negative data that comes out, that we communicate well to the families and foundations, say this is what failure might have looked like or might look like, but we're not going anywhere. So let's buck up and stay the course and try to address this. It's about unmet need rather than market size, and let's stay and try to and that to me is a lot what I see the difference between small biotech and big pharma is that focus on unmet need and that unwavering commitment to staying the course. And sure, there's a failure, but let's just learn from it and keep going on the same course because we're not going anywhere. We have that commitment that's lasting. Before I answer one great question that came up, I thought it might be a good idea, and feel free to say no, Imran, Norma, and Stormy, but I always like to make sure that people say, if there was a call to action that each of you might have that could be, in any part of the R&D process or what you do, what might it be? Maybe Imran, if not to put you on the spot, but if there was a call to action to our colleagues, to our friends, and to the scientific community, and the biotech community, what might that be from you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, I think. I mean, there's so many things that do come to mind for me. I think that, with respect to, our mission at CyDan, it's really to advance therapies for high need patient populations. And I think that there are so many aspects that are important to engage in doing that. I think the theme of this meeting really is to engage the patient community in doing that. So I think that is I think an appropriate call to action and really just being very intentional about engaging the patient community. I think also just even on that last question, what I think is really important, I think there's something that we've faced both on the nonprofit side, but also on the company side, is walking that line between certainly wanting to provide hope for the patient community, but at the same time managing expectations and not over-promising, which will make you susceptible to under-delivering. I think that's a really important point. And I think there's a fine line that you have to walk in doing that. So again, I think that's something that we've certainly done. And I think the other point that was made earlier, I think that if you're not failing, you're doing something wrong. I think that you're not taking enough risk in terms of the programs. And I think what you said earlier, Luke, try to fail quickly. Obviously, you've got to, be a good steward of investor resources, but really to fail quickly by doing the killer experiments, up front. And sometimes one thing that we faced is we've seen a lot of groups that are just really, interested in the science, but they're not doing the killer experiments that would really give insight as to whether a project has legs to move forward or not. So I think that's another point, is just to being very thoughtful about how you progress programs in a way that would actually give you the answer that you need to be able to move a project forward. So again, a lot of thoughts in that, but I'm not sure, that those are some things that come to mind.
No, those are great answers. I would kind of push back and challenge one part of that, and it's something that we hear a lot in the community, right? Is expectation management, and part of me always thinks, well, who is a company to tell me how to manage our expectations as a community, right? Part of me thinks that we can remove the burden of manage the idea that you have to manage expectations by being completely honest from moment one. Right. And this is the process. This is what we're doing. This is what we're trying to accomplish. It might not happen, but, expectations and managing those expectations is really up to the community. We're going to drive forward and work with you to articulate the challenges and what might happen. So, it's a loaded question, I know, but it was really great points. I think that the venture capital or the business model part of all of this is something that is really fragile, like Norma said, if that people are constantly thinking about and aware of. Norma, if you had a call to action to the broad community, what might it be?
So again, look, I always come back to having, I grew up always dreaming to be, somebody who did cancer research. I then found myself as part of the Human Genome Project. And in the middle of the whole thing, I discovered that my husband has cancer. So looking at it from all sides, the ability to actually move the science from the lab to impacting on a patient population is huge. And anything that we can do to expedite that, to me. So, I look back and I think, if he were alive today, we probably could cure him, but that wasn't the way it was. And, it's really being able to have access to patient information, having access to patient samples. I think no matter who you are, when you walk into hospital, whether it be in a community setting or an academic health center, patients should be consented to provide samples, saying that anything that's in excess of what's needed for a diagnosis can be used for research. They can opt out, but being able to create, again, the resources that companies can then tap into, and then again making it such that it's a much more fluid process, so that all of this isn't so hard. The obstacles aren't so hard to overcome for both the academic labs as well as the companies that then take those findings and drive towards commercialization and getting them out into the population. And to me, it's just speed. I think about it, I'm like, my God, we completed that first draft of the human genome 20 years ago. How is that possible? But it's been 20 years, right? And I look at cystic fibrosis and the children who are lucky enough now to have a therapeutic that transforms their lives. But there are still other children out there who haven't been able to, benefit from that. And for me, it's really, how can we speed up the process from, when Gleevec was discovered, it took 40, or the Philadelphia chromosome was discovered, it took 40 some years before Gleevec actually hit the market. So, you as, a father, me as a spouse, and my two sons, impact, it's not just, it's the patient, it's the patient's family. And as we go along in life, any one of us, this can happen to any of us. I gave a TED talk, and the title of the talk was, why not me? Why not you, right? It can, any of these things can happen. So finding ways at each point of the path, how can, government, universities, and investors, the community, we need to support the science, and we need to drive that science towards an end which impacts on the population in a beneficial way and make it faster.
That's Norma. That's my call to action too, right? Is urgency and speed, and make it faster and make it happen faster because we can. That's huge, great points. Stormy, if you had a call to action for the community, the scientific, the patient, the community, what would that call to action be?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would first ask the academics to share. There are perverse incentives in academia, and academics need to share their materials. They need to share everything they do as quickly as they can, before it's published as well, with the proper caveats, right? I think we need to be very open because that's our job in academia. I think my call to industry and biotech would be to partner, find the experts and bring in the experts in every avenue that you need them. I think this idea of people needing to build it themselves in house. I don't think that works anymore. That we can't be fast if we do that. And then my call to patient advocacy groups is build the resources that are going to attract companies to your disorder. I think having the patient advocacy group, or having the natural history studies and the patient registries and whatnot really help facilitate companies to be interested in your disorder. And I've seen that bring in companies, and that's, you want to do that. You want to have that ready to move products forward.
That's great. Yep, I couldn't agree more. And I think that I know it's time to wrap up. I'm getting the notice here, but there's some comments came in that I just want to make sure I mentioned, because they're really important, is that we have to bake the setbacks into our process and understand how to learn from them. I think that's just a beautiful way of putting it. And in that comment from Hans, he also used the word learning and grit. And I think it is all about grit and urgency and collaboration. Our friend Mike Porath always has a great toast, and that's to urgency and collaboration. And I think that's what this is all about. And I can't thank you enough, Imran, Norma, and Stormy, for putting up with me and for having this dialogue and conversation.
Well, Luke, I think the one thing we should all remember is each of us, just as the Human Genome Project taught us, we were able to achieve something that was considered impossible because we all work together. Mm-hmm. And if we carry forward with that model, and Stormy's absolutely right, partnerships for companies are key. You don't have to do it all yourself. You don't, it's like the old academic, this is my stuff in my lab and I'm not going to share with anybody. Those patient samples are sitting in -80 freezers. They belong in biobanks, or they belong in a place where they can be shared with everybody. So, I mean,
absolutely. And industrialized.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you, Norma. Derek, I see that we might be out of time. It's time for us to wrap up here, and I can't thank everybody enough. This has been awesome.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Great moderator, Luke.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you for joining us for NewYorkBIO's first Patient Engagement Summit. All of the panels from the event can be found online on NewYorkBIO's YouTube channel, and we hope they will be shared and heard. We want to thank our sponsors and our partners for coming together to help build an exceptional event, and we hope to see you next year at what will be our second annual Patient Engagement Summit. Until then,